All right, hey, thanks for that introduction, Steve. Great to be here. Thank you all for staying. This has been an excellent day, really informative, especially for someone like me who's not in politics. I mean, I did vote, but that's about it as far as my understanding of how all these things work. So I've learned a lot today. To start today about familiar with, I'd like to ask each one of my panelists here to introduce themselves. We'll go right down the line, starting with Alex. Please tell us who you are, what you do, where you work, and I don't know, something fun about you.
Oh boy. Hi, thanks all for staying. Alex Kellner from Pulpit Interact. Managing Director. I manage our Chicago office and our political practice. This past cycle, and Pulpit Interactive is the largest digital marketer in the Democratic Party. And I focused largely in the super PAC world for the last 2 years in particular. And my fun fact is I just got back from my honeymoon, so this is like the first real serious thing I've done since then, so please bear with me.
Fun.
I'm Billy McBeath, the Digital Director at Senate Leadership Fund, American Crossroads. Been there for about a cycle, mainly focused on persuasion, but GOTV's kind of been my passion project for a few years now. Fun fact, I majored in Chinese and no one can figure out why.
That's a really fun fact. Nice.
That's better.
Hey, I'm Jessalyn Reid. I'm head of digital at Hilltop Public Solutions, but in 2018 was Senator Tim Kaine's digital director, where we, I think, ran a fairly unique Senate digital program in that we brought everything in-house aside from actual placement. So every piece of creative for all of Turnout, all of Persuasion was done in-house. So here to talk about that. And something fun about me is that I went to school in Montreal, so this snow is like a walk in the park.
Right on.
My name is Jeff Rich. I am the digital political director at the RNC. I work hand in hand with our political department to deploy contact strategies online. And fun fact about me, I guess, I am a huge Pittsburgh Penguins fan.
Ah, nice. Are they good? I have no idea. I don't know anything about hockey. Are they good, Penguins?
They're very good, yes.
Nice. All right, well, good luck with that this year. All right, so we're talking about GOTV. GOTV is often called the ground game. Why? What broadly is GOTV is my first question for anyone on the panel to kind of jump in and tell me. And then I want to talk after that about sort of how GOTV has kind of changed in the last 10 years, kind of in lockstep with American politics, maybe even geopolitics. 10 years is a long time. So let's talk about GOTV, where it is today, where has it been? Go ahead, Alex.
I did a stint as a professor at GW, so I can expound on this. So GOTV stands for Get Out the Vote. It's very simply, you spend the beginning part of your campaign making contacts and raising money, then you try to change people's mind who are definitely going to vote but haven't made up their mind who they're going to vote for, and then you end the campaign by ensuring the people who historically vote for you actually show up on election day. Americans don't vote, so in a midterm, way less than 50% of people vote. In a presidential, a little bit more than that, but still a large portion of the American electorate doesn't vote. So there are people who historically vote in certain ways, and you want them to show up for your party. I'll stop there. Anyone else?
Well, that's good as a definition. Does everyone kind of agree on that definition? Okay, sweet. So talk to me about sort of how GOTV has kind of changed, especially recently, right? I mean, things are different than they were 10 years ago, and certain things have changed in the last 10 years. And what I mean by things is changes in state and federal laws. Consumer media consumption has certainly changed. The local and national economic situation has changed. So you guys are kind of, wading in new waters or whatever, right? So do you have anything to say about that leading up to today?
Yeah, I think you're starting to see states take elections differently. Like Colorado is mail only. Everybody goes. Florida, they have heavy AB/EV voting. Missouri, that's more election day voting. So when you're looking at GOTV, you're looking at how people are voting, at what time they're voting, and then you're kind of building backwards for your AB plan, your EV plan, your election day plan. And then you're looking at it from a different medium perspective. What are you doing on phones? What are you doing on mail? What are you doing on digital? What are you doing on television? Then you kind of build all that together, and then you can take the voter file, like Florida, they do a really good job where you're getting a return file. So then you take that return file and you onboard it, and you look at what creatives are doing best online or what universes or your phones are doing well, and you kind of just continuously make your plan better by the results that you're seeing. It's kind of like a direct response marketing where you're looking at sales and then you're just working backwards to see what works best.
Interesting. Okay. So would you say that it's fundamentally different than persuasion advertising? Because Alex mentioned that they kind of go together at times, more or less, right? Or not at times?
I was more talking about the phases of, an election.
It's like a weird political funnel that's different than the funnel that I'm used to.
Yes and no. I mean, they're different audiences, and for the most part, there's a little bit of overlap. But I mean, I think you asked, GOTV is called the ground game. The reason for that is because it started at the doors.
Right.
And frankly, that's still where the majority of the resources go, is voters, volunteers, more often than not, talking to voters at the door and asking them to vote. And I think that, there's a lot that has been learned, particularly on the academic side, about what tactics explicitly make people more likely to vote. And then the big change that I've seen. And so when you talk about digital GOTV, it's taking what we've done at the field for a while and just replicating that online. I think one of the things that's interesting that we've seen lately is a new kind of track, which is a more persuasion, to get back to your question, the kind of persuasion side of GOTV, which is motivating people who may not have the voting history that their vote matters to show up, as opposed to some of the tactical things we did at the doors.
So digital plays a huge role in the evolution of this, particularly recently, right? Can you talk a little bit about how sort of digital kind of reinforces this field game, specific to what you've worked on in 2018? And I'd like to hear from each of you, please.
I can jump in on that one.
Okay.
One thing that I think has really changed, and I'm sure that you've touched on this in panels earlier today, I'm sure Greta Carnes talked a ton about it, an acronym about texting and text out the vote and what that means and how to do it right. But I think one thing that it really changes is your capacity to reach everyone in your Turnout universe, and not just if you're doing a ground game in the last 4 days, you can build the volunteer capacity over time to reach all of those people in those last 4 days. But if you can also text them, your capacity is hugely increased. So how do you actually address that now that you can reach all of these people at any moment? How do you build a more sophisticated turnout, and how do you evolve that message over time? So to Alex's point about persuading people, and to some, to the degree that there's overlap, then motivating them to turn out. How do you build a turnout message over time and not just talk to them in the last 4 days, but have turnout that actually backs up further and further into their psyche, I guess, even, as far out as August.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jess just mentioned. And just to reiterate, when you're doing persuasion advertising, you're targeting kind of different universes that you would with a GOTV advertisement. So with persuasion advertising, you're going to target a soft Dem or a soft Republican, and then folks that are maybe independent who can either swing each way. So those are swing voters. And then when you do GOTV advertising, you basically you'll have a bucket of people. So that could be in the bank universe. So people that are always going to vote for you, you want to make sure those people get out. Then you also want to make sure that lower propensity voters get out to the polls and vote for you as well, and that can really swing an election.
Mm-hmm. And how much you spend on each of those groups kind of depends on what your goals are, right? So in the last election cycle, what was that for each of you?
Persuasion versus a turnout spend?
Yeah.
Well, so what's interesting too, I think, is that, turnout is time bound. So all of your turnout spend is happening in the last 6 weeks of the election, whereas persuasion, you may start, way further out if you're someone like Tim Kaine, who's been planning this run for a long time, which obviously he was. So for us, it balanced at, let's say maybe 20% or less of our spend was on turnout messaging, and that was, of our digital spend specifically, and that was over the last 8 weeks of the campaign.
Uh-huh.
It's also a smaller universe for us.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're about in the same place. I focus more on persuasion, so we spend heavily on, video assets, and then, if we have a little funding left over, we'll go in and do GOTV, so it's a smaller portion of our budget.
Okay, but what about the RNC?
So the RNC, we go really heavy in GOTV and kind of allow the campaigns and the other committees and IEs and PACs to do the messaging for persuasion pieces. So a large chunk, I would say at least 80% of our budget is going towards turnout.
Wow, okay.
So I don't work explicitly in an organization, but one of the organizations I worked with last cycle very closely is called Next Gen America. And their principal goal was to talk to 18 to 35-year-old Americans about this election for the Democratic side. They spent 95% of their budget on mobilization and turnout because most 18 to 35-year-olds are going to vote Democratic, and they don't need to be persuaded to vote for a given candidate. That's the extreme end. In contrast, I also worked with Claire McCaskill's campaign in Missouri. They spent about 35% on turnout. But I think ultimately the question in terms of, and you've heard some ranges up here, it's all about the path to victory. So this was a midterm election where turnout matters a little bit more, but also one on the Democratic side where there was a wave of enthusiasm in a lot of places. And so investing on running up that score was how we were able to win back the House, for example, by turning out more people. But that may not be the same equation in a presidential election or in frankly, a different midterm cycle.
Right, and I'm still wondering, who won the midterms?
Tim Kaine.
Mitch McConnell, I'm going to say.
House Democrats?
You can all have your own answer for that, yeah, go ahead. Jeff, you don't want to say? Well, I guess.
I mean, I would say that we had victory, the Republicans had victories in the Senate, and then obviously the Democrats taking over the House was huge for them.
Okay, all right, diplomatic answer. So, all right, now that it's all said and done, what did you guys learn about how you approached GOTV this time around, right? I mean, it's very different than 4 years ago. Oh, and by the way, I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that midterms are always very different than a presidential cycle. Is that correct? In terms of the field operation especially, right? It's more important for midterms. Is that correct, or is that not correct? The sort of door-to-door, getting people on the ground. Is that true, or am I making that up?
Alex's point about turnout, obviously turnout, the goal of a GOTV program is turnout, and turnout happens more naturally in presidentials, so.
But we've also heard the numbers are very big, right? The American eligible voting population actually voted in the midterms, which is kind of a record since a long time ago. Is that correct? So I got one of my questions was, did you guys just really do your jobs well, or what is that down to? That's great, right? I mean, for you, right? No?
A lot of things helped. I mean, I think the atmosphere.
Such as?
Donald Trump helped
Who's that?
Democrats. That's a novel concept. Again, I think, and by the way, turnout varies dramatically. The stat to go back to the youth vote, we can't say millennials anymore because they're older than 35 now.
What about Gen Z? Do they vote yet? No, they don't.
Starting to.
Okay.
I think this was the first election where some of them were eligible. But anyway, 30% of 18 to 35-year-olds showed up, which is literally 50% higher. And it's usually about 20% than they've literally ever done before. And so I do think that there were some really strong efforts focusing on youth. I think traditionally GOTV is very tactical, which I touched on at the beginning. We ask people to pledge to vote and then remind them about it. We ask people to confirm their polling place so that they know how to vote. We ask people to make a plan to vote. So they start thinking about these things, which we know, I mean, literally there are academic studies that show that that means people are more likely to show up. What we did differently this cycle is we ran a lot of GOTV ads that didn't mention candidates at all. For organizations that could. Because what we really were focusing on making people feel like they were confident and eligible to vote, which a lot of people don't, and that their vote mattered by showing that close elections, frankly talking about Donald Trump and what's happened to the country in the case of the types of people we were talking to. And so that to me is the biggest thing I've learned and saw that was different this cycle versus previous.
The soft sell works with some people versus others?
It's not even that it's a soft sell. It's that if you're starting to talk about explicit candidates, they're more likely to tune you out. And that's not the attitude you need to change. It's rather that they need to feel either qualified or invested in voting. Because frankly, it's not necessarily the candidate that's going to motivate them explicitly, especially when you're talking about a House race or a Senate race or a state ledge race or et cetera.
Got it.
Yeah, and I, just to build off of what Alex said, our most successful ads were actually just generic social pressure ads, which just show this person voted, this person voted, this person voted, you have not voted, don't be the only person who doesn't vote. And that actually worked better.
That works every
any type
time.
of issue-based ad or
It can have backlash. It doesn't work
Really?
every time.
Let's
Yes.
hear about that. Let's hear about the backlash. No?
I mean, social pressure is inherently creepy. It does work. I mean, there's a reason a lot of people invest in it, but you can go too far.
That's what this whole thing is, basically. So now that the midterms are over, I did ask this before, and I don't feel like I got the right answers. What did you learn? Since you both won, both sides, everybody won, what did you learn? What could you improve next time?
I think the biggest thing that we saw, and I'm sure y'all heard it all day, was texting was great for this because it's a more direct response type marketing method. So we saw that. We saw email funnels doing great. I mean, it's kind of the procession of digital, period. You know, it's all display, it's all email, it's all text, and just making sure that you are hammering your audiences, divvying them up, having an AB audience, an EV audience, and an election day audience, making sure you're saying the right thing to the right person at the right time. You know.
And what role would you say the mega platforms played in your success? I mean, there is a duopoly, right? Most of your money, I imagine, went to the two. Digital money, excuse me. We're talking digital. What about their transparency tools? How do you rate them? How effective were they? What do they need to improve for you and for consumers? That kind of thing. Love to hear from each of you on that, please.
I think the transparency tools were pretty effective this cycle, and I think it's good for consumers to be able to see what organizations are running what ads, and it prevents bad actors on these platforms. So I don't think there's really many complaints on our side, but we certainly want to make sure that issue advocacy groups and news organizations are still considered like political advertisers, considering that they put out political headlines. So that's like a concern for Republicans when you have like the New York Times or the Washington Post putting out kind of more opinionated headlines. So we hope that continues to be in the transparency reports.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm all for transparency. The more the better, absolutely. I think it only holds all of us accountable. It's only good. And it's interesting, too, when we talk about GOTV, field organizers have had to answer these questions forever. When you knock on someone's door and they're like, how'd you get my name? How are you approaching me? I mean, it's only fair that we should all answer those things. I think it is great. I think we're making small steps. I think Facebook and Google have a lot more to answer for, a lot more to do, but you'll get there. But to your question about learnings, one thing in Virginia that we really took away was the value of a true coordinated campaign that was like actually coordinated from Senate to school board and everything in between. I think a lot of people have been trying to perfect that, and when you were in a situation like we had one digital director for Senate and coordinated, and we had 4 targeted House races. We won 3 of them, flipped 3 House seats. I think that it really showed the value of having true coordination as much as possible across the ticket in all of your strategy.
I want to talk about coordination in a minute, but Billy, go ahead.
Love the transparency reports. I'm all for the arms race it's going to bring about.
The arms race?
Yeah, it's going to be great.
Really exciting.
So yeah, to the transparency report, everyone should have to be transparent online. I will say there is a little bit of a double-edged sword in that, so any other platform out there that is running political ads put out a transparency report, because what happened this cycle was in the same way that campaign managers and decision makers match red bar, blue bar on television, they started doing it on Facebook and Google. And so what that meant was, first of all, most people are there, they have the majority of the inventory, they should have the majority of the spend, but a disproportionately high amount of spend went to those platforms because no one gets fired for matching point for point or dollar for dollar. And so there was less money that went to other platforms that may have in cases been strategic because it didn't help get parity in the transparency reports. The other, just to go back to your previous question about what we learned, the other thing I would add that I think was the biggest difference in 2018, and one of the reasons in the House in particular where Democrats saw success, is we expanded our targets. Historically, GOTV is done to infrequent voters, people who vote not in every election, maybe they only vote in a presidential election and not in a midterm, but we're pretty confident they vote Democratic. And there's a ceiling there. There's a limited number of people that applies to based on voting record. What I think Democrats did this cycle that was different and incredibly effective and why we won many of these races is we expanded that universe. And again, talking about that motivation, trying to bring new people into the process is something that on digital and historically, we had very, very narrow parameters on who we targeted, and when you expand that, it increases the ceiling pretty dramatically.
Thank you. I want to focus. All right, so I want to focus a little bit on social now for a second. Talk a little bit about how the owned and earned social game has kind of changed, particularly since 2016, maybe even the last 4 years. And then what paid formats, owned and earned as well as paid formats. Obviously, some of those have changed as well. And then finally, touch on influencer marketing, if you would. And I know, I don't even think that's a thing in political marketing, but it obviously is in other parts of marketing that I cover. What do you regard as influencer marketing? Yeah, all of those things. That's a lot of questions. But anyway, we'll go down the line again, starting with Jeff.
When it comes to earned media, I think we definitely have a benefit in that the president has such high reach on Twitter, and anything that he tweets then gets repeated on the national news outlets. So I think it was during the 2016 campaign, I think he had like $4 billion in free earned media. I mean, that's huge, and you don't really need to spend money on advertising when your message is getting out there like that.
No, you don't. That's amazing, right?
So that kind of answers that first part. But in terms of what channels we're spending the most money on, we saw great results with YouTube, TrueView for Action this cycle, and as well as buying programmatic inventory through various trade desks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, must be nice. I think, I'm probably the only digital director who is like fully cool with owned social, like being a comms thing. I think that we like digital and new media, and it's been like a wild ride over the last few cycles of what digital gets to own and what is communications and how you even define digital and all of this stuff. And I think that ultimately, like, if you take @Tim Kaine on Twitter. He has about 1 million followers. It's really just for press. Like, there aren't, our target voters are really not huge Twitter users. So the Twitter presence is really a press play. And so I had, a great press team, and we worked together, and they ran that, and I ran other stuff. And it was, I think there needs to be a kind of like reassessment of what falls under different categories, and not, I think people get a little bit like feisty about needing to own things because digital has been kept away from the table for so long that then you get really like proprietary about things. So there's that about owned social.
Here.
Yeah, agreed, same.
Who likes writing tweets? Like, leave that to comms, come on. And then I think like influencer marketing is interesting. We did some of it insofar as you consider press influencers. The Senate race in Virginia was a very fascinating one. It was Corey Stewart versus Tim Kaine. I think that there was a lot to talk about, but we had a lot and people weren't really covering it, and there was some kind of like, I want to say, insane things going on, maybe is a good way to put it. I'm sure you guys are familiar with Corey Stewart. And so we ran a lot of targeted ads around the Capitol in Richmond and around the Capitol in DC and to like Northern Virginia and to hit DC press corps, just to try to like get some things in front of their face, because he would be defending Roy Moore and doing all, kind of accusing Tim Kaine of pretty crazy stuff during debates. And so really to try to get some press coverage when they weren't answering emails, it was like, well, let's just like put some ads in front of you. So I would say that's an interesting use of influencer marketing that we certainly had some success with in Virginia.
Okay, all right, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think influencer marketing is a very early campaign thing that you should be using, because it's easy to like kind of help push your entire agenda out there when no one's really paying attention. And you're out there trying to build your own name brand. But when it comes down to like networks, what we saw this cycle was I spent a lot of time looking at where are my efficiencies in video views. Like, how do I account for a 6, a 15, and a 30-second spot? When it comes down to it, you're paying like 17 cents on Facebook, or 6 cents on Google, or 2 cents on a programmatic network. Like, how do you equalize everything out? You look at it in something like a cost per second viewed or a cost per second viewable viewed, and where is your best dollar spent? And that's where we spent a lot of the time, just making sure that our efficiencies were right, not really caring about what medium we were buying on, just making sure that we were being efficient, taking the resources we were given and multiplying them as large as we could.
Hey, quickly, when it comes to organic versus paid, they have to work together. That yes, the president's tweets get picked up by everybody, but President spent $640,000 in the last 7 days on Facebook, which is, I believe, more than the next 5 advertisers combined. Those things are working together, and that's why he's doing well with a big segment of the population. So these things go together. I think that, I believe someone was talking about this in the text, it might have been Greta, in the text message conversation, but we need to be able to empower our audience, our supporters, in the same way that we trust them to go talk to someone on the door and to pick up the phone and talk to someone to phone bank. We need to trust them to produce content and talk to their friends in the same way. And I think that's something where Republicans outpaced Democrats for a while. We held way too much control over the message and the messenger. And that's something that I think started to change in the last cycle, but will need to even more in 2020 if Democrats want to catch up with Trump.
Let me look at your primary right now with AOC out there forcing everyone on Instagram Live and, you know, cooking in their kitchen and stuff.
Please, no more dental cleanings.
So we talked a bit all day about, you know, P2P texting and how this was a breakout kind of year for that tactic. I'm wondering how you see that evolving, you know, in the next couple of years, and I also wondering about like in-app alerts and notifications. Was that a feature that you know, you used heavily this time around, and how did you do so?
Jess?
Or does it not even factor? It doesn't? Oh, all right. I don't know.
But I have a lot to say about texting, but it may have been covered in the earlier panel.
Go ahead. That's all right. I wasn't listening, so I want to hear it. Okay. I mean, I was, but you know, you can't listen all the time. Come on. Anyway.
Well, I just think the most critical thing with peer-to-peer texting, because it's important to have a conversation back and forth. It's important not to abuse it. It's important not to spam people. I think that's critical, and people say they understand it, but then it comes down to GOTV, and you're like, well, we have 300 numbers. Sorry, I'm getting phone calls on stage. I have a locksmith in my house. So when you have 300,000 phone numbers, and you're like, serious. I can talk to all these voters at once. You know, it's very tempting, I think, to hit send and get people just to hit send and have these, you know, this push notification on people's phones and not actually engage in a back and forth conversation that is like a real, like respectful communication with a constituent or a voter. So I think that's really critical, and it's only going to be a problem if people don't actually have conversations over a long term. And especially, I think part of that is just like data. So making sure that you know, you're sharing data, and it's not just like one campaign rolls in, sends all these billions of texts, and then the next campaign rolls in, has no idea what's been said, and just picks up, you know, starts a new conversation. So I think there's some like data sharing over time that needs to happen to make it an impactful, long-term, sustainable communication tool.
The only thing I would add, I agree it's a really important tactic. I think 2020 will be peak text messaging, because I think whether it's a technology change in the same way that email, like Gmail filters out messages from campaigns into a secondary bucket, other mail platforms do the same, whether it's that or regulation, I think it's going to get reined in a little bit, because I think it's going to be even bigger in 2020 and there will be backlash. But we should use it now.
Yeah, and start like using good practices right now, because if you're actually having a conversation with a voter over multiple cycles, that's not going to go in their spam like text inbox, if that's a thing.
So is what you do more reactive or proactive? Bit of both?
Yes.
Yes. All right, well, thanks. So I want to talk, all right, Jeff, I have some questions. I have a question for you. So I read in the trade press that the RNC strategy was, you know, focusing on field ops, was heavily on field ops rather. It was highly publicized anyway. So you said it was like 80% of your budget, is that correct? Like sort of GOTV was 80% or something like that, turnout. Well, my back question is like, you know, you've got this permanent volunteer force, I guess, in all these key states, leading up to 2016, that is, and social media is a main focus. How did you build your database? Like, is this like a top-down database? What is it? Using what publicly available data? What data collected via phone surveys and media registrations and things like that? Who owns it, and who gets access to it in your party?
So GOP data, it's something that the party invested in heavily after the 2012 elections. They've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on it. It works both as a top-down and bottom-up approach. So, you know, we're constantly doing surveys out in the field, so that gets put into the ecosystem. We allow any Republican campaign or candidate to use GOP data from local races to, you know, federal races. So if they're doing contact, all of that data comes back into the ecosystem as well. So it's a very rich data set that we're always working with.
Okay. Well, it sounds very coordinated. What do the Democrats do? Does anyone? I mean, I don't know. We probably don't have the right guy up here to talk about that. But do you guys know? I mean, being left-leaning, Jesselyn and Alex.
Just leaning, just left leaning.
Or whatever. I don't know. Maybe that was an assumption. My bad.
D. Yeah, I think that Democrats have some like data reckoning to do to make sure that our party, to make sure that our party is using everything efficiently and making sure that it is like streamlined and you know, I think people are working on it. I think that the DNC is doing a great job. I really support their efforts to bring in talent and like make strides for the entire party up and down. I think it's great. I think we'll get there.
Okay.
Yeah, there's always things we can do better. I think, you know, that there is a lot of data sharing, but there's ways that it can improve. One of the other organizations I worked with was Priorities, and Danielle, who was up here earlier, who I think did a really great job of facilitating the coordination across the super PACs, which has a little bit less to do with the voter contact that's happening at the doors, but does online and via other channels. There are other ones. America Votes also did a lot of work on this as well. So I think people are thinking about it and working at it. And so I think there are ways in which Democrats are ahead of Republicans, and there's certainly ways vice versa on this topic.
Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the demographics of GOTV next, and you know, sort of how you guys know what to focus on. I mean, obviously the data will inform you, but you know, there's low-hanging fruit out there to be had with any election. I think you guys all recognize that, and you know, did well with that, right, in the last cycle. But going kind of forward, and also even in the last election, I'd like to talk a little bit more about independents, the swing voters, and kind of how you each regard them, maybe differently or the same, or sort of, and what the demographics of GOTV are for independents. I mean, is there like any mechanism for that? I mean, is it just kind of like all persuasion?
I'll start.
Like
Typically, we don't
independent?
turn out, as I think everyone on this stage doesn't spend any time turning out independent voters, because there's an equal chance we're going to turn out a vote for the other party, and that is not our goal.
Oh, okay, so you don't even do it.
No, because historically, if you're talking to an independent voter, it's because they have a history of voting. And that said, they vote in both directions. So your goal is changing their vote choice, but you're not talking to them unless they're going to show up. Again, our dollars are limited, even the wealthiest campaigns or organizations or super PACs, and that's two interventions. To convince someone to vote for you and then to convince them to vote is a lot of work when there are better targets who you can do one or the other.
Right. Okay. Well, now I know I didn't get any messages this cycle. You know, so we're in an age of extreme partisanship, you know, politicalization of kind of everything in the media these days in particular. Is it fair to say that GOTV is like the main thing that happens in a political climate like this?
No.
Well, how important is it then?
I think it's critically important. I mean, as Jess said, it's a little bit time-bound to the end of the campaign. Convincing someone to vote 4 months before Election Day, they have time to revert. And so it has to be at the end. Now, obviously, if there's early vote or vote by mail, that gets pushed up a little bit, like I think Jeff was talking about, one of you were talking about earlier. So we spend more time and more dollars persuading because we can do it for longer, but it doesn't mean it's more or less important. I think they're both important, again, but it varies by election. There are certain states where GOTV, and certain elections where GOTV is more important than persuasion, and there's some where persuasion is far more important than GOTV.
All right. Well, I'm done almost. I'm gonna say I'm gonna close with this quote from Alex's company's website, which is, "Trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Even favorability is volatile and in short supply. In this environment, people no longer simply accept assertions from marketing. Winning today requires believers for whom there is a fusion of confidence in your message and alignment with their values." I like that. So, what fosters belief? You know, if you can't believe things that you read or hear, or even facts quoted by the media, or even research firms or counterintelligence entities, how do you convert believers these days? You know, how do you persuade them to change their opinions in a world where opinions are kind of more important than anything? Is the lack of belief the reason that 50% of Americans didn't vote?
You hire BPI and we tell you. No,
Oh, there you go.
jokes.
There you go. I just plugged you
But
guys.
thank you for reading our marketing language. That was lovely.
I liked
so
it.
I think the answer is there's no monolithic answer to this because everyone is different. And this is why, this is something Danielle talked a lot about and Pamela talked a lot about, is that you have to do research to identify who these people are. So whether that's real world testing of message, whether that is panels or focus groups or surveys ahead of time, to try to identify the best messages or creative approaches to foster that belief. I think when it comes to voting, one thing I found, particularly with young people, is messenger matters and the message matters. It's not about voting for Clara McCaskill for Senate, it's about the fact that like, I don't think I know enough to vote. Like there's all this information and it's scary and I don't feel like I'm qualified. Like all these people know more than me, so I shouldn't vote. And if we can convince people that they do know enough to vote, that makes them far more likely. And that works for a subset of pessimistic 18 to 35-year-olds that we can identify. That's a pretty small group, and so finding the right message that works for them as compared to a person of color who feels disenfranchised and the political system has let them by, if we can give them some examples of how, you know, a party or a, you know, political ideology actually can help them or how the opposite side is hurting them, that message can work. And again, like a young Latina could respond more with a message that we typically associate with millennials than because she's Latina and vice versa. And so not coming with preconceptions, but creating a program that helps tell you those things is what I found to build believers.
That was a softball for you.
Thank
It's
you.
on your website. I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say.
I mean, I agree with everything you just said, but I think you touched on something that's kind of terrifying to me is like, what happens when Facebook says PolitiFact is going to be the arbiter of truth on our platform? Or what happens when Google says X company will be the arbiter of truth on our platform?
Yeah.
How is that going to affect advertising and free speech?
Well, it certainly would affect it, right? But what happens when the government tells you that instead of PolitiFact?
Well, I mean, there's a First Amendment for that one.
No, look, I mean, any third party. I mean, you got to believe at some level that, you know, there's got to be some belief behind the things that we're doing, right? I don't know. I mean, I feel like everybody just gets to pick and choose what they believe these days.
Well, I would definitely second what Alex said about, you know, actually finding messaging that resonates, but in particular, messaging that's authentic. And in order to find messaging that resonates with the groups you're talking to, you have to have people who identify as members of those groups as a part of the conversation. And you look at this stage, everyone up here is white. I'm the only woman. Like, you know, you have to bring more people of color, more LGBTQ,
Absolutely.
more people from working class backgrounds. Like, you really have to bring more people to the table right from the beginning and have them at high levels, have everyone part of the conversation. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to have messaging that resonates, and you're never going to turn people out or persuade them. So I think that's critical.
Okay. Jeff?
What she said?
Yeah, just to conclude, I would say I agree with what all the other panelists said. At the RNC, you know, we definitely believe like that one-to-one, face-to-face conversation is very important for campaigns. So that's very effective for us. So, you know, it's really important for candidates to get out in their community, identify groups of people, and stand for, you know, messages that positively affect these communities.
All right. With that, I would like to open up questions to you guys on the floor. And you guys look tired. No, it's been a long day, but it's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed it. So, Steve, do you have a question for these?
I do want to know about what I think, because I think maybe, Alex, this goes to a point that you made earlier on about by focusing on particular channels, did we know what we were missing? Did we know what voters we were missing either, and again, this speaks to some degree to the mobile point and texting. Who's left out of that equation, and the channels that we're using for all of these, are there populations and voter groups that we're missing by focusing where we're focusing?
By relying only on first party data, you are missing people who move around a lot, like college students or recent graduates or people of color, for example. People, the other way that we match data is by financial accounts. And so if you have fewer credit cards or bank accounts or various things, we have less data to match you one-to-one. So what that means is less one-to-one targeting. with a lot of GOTV if you want to bring in new people. And then the laws of each state matter. There are certain places where you can register on election day, so that means I can talk to everybody. There are certain states where you have to register to vote 45 days before election day if you want to vote, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to talk to someone who's unregistered, because that's $1 wasted. So know your local laws, for one, and two, think about where your data is coming from to expand, and use platform data to help, target whether it's demographic or attitudes that correspond with new voters.
Were any of you, and finally, were any of you having to anticipate or encounter suppression activity that you felt you had to counter with your get out the vote activity? That you weren't just trying to encourage people to vote, but you found yourselves in situations or in campaigns where you knew you had to make a counter argument?
We were certainly worried about that. I think that ultimately our opponent didn't have enough resources or planning to do any suppression work, but we definitely did think about it and plan for it, and I think it is getting to be a problem that you misinformation and reverse GOTV in a way. So I think it is critical to look at your turnout targets and make sure that you're giving correct information, but also to think about when you're facing bad information about where to vote or how to vote, that you're not repeating it, little things that you need to address with voter protection and voter expansion, I think become more important, and it gets more important to do voter education as a part of your turnout program. So voter education is the ad.
I've definitely seen it happen in 2016 in several races I was in. I heard some anecdotes, but didn't see it firsthand in 18. But yeah, Republicans or some entity, I'm not blaming anyone here on the stage, were telling voters of color that election day was on a Wednesday instead of Tuesday, or wrong day, or the deadline for something had passed that it didn't. This absolutely happens. There's no silver bullet to answering it, though. Honestly, you have to keep doing what you're doing, which is educating people and finding messengers that are more credible. Don't believe what you heard from this page. Go look at this thing that's official, and finding the person who can deliver that message, and trying to identify the people who may have seen said message and making sure they see the correct information over and over again.
All right. No one else? All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you, panel. I appreciate it.